So in today's live stream, Professor Baruch Halpern returns to History Valley, and today we're going to be talking about the dating of the Old Testament and debunking pseudo-historical claims. So a PowerPoint was prepared today to talk about this specifically. There are several claims made about the Old Testament, very strange claims made about it by many people, even those that dispute the dating of the Old Testament, and they think it's all wrong, and they'll try to squeeze it into the 3rd century BCE for one or more reasons. So anyhow, welcome back to History Valley, Professor Halpern.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to start us off with the first image. Hebrew is Greek. So in this book here, it claims that Hebrew is derived from the Greek language. What is your reaction to this, Professor?
Linguistics is a discipline that has a certain logic to it, a certain number of rules. And Greek and Hebrew have no relation under those rules. Let me give you a very simple example. In the Greek noun system, every noun is marked by a case ending which tells you its function in a sentence. The function might be the actor, in which case it will end with an S, os, if it's masculine. The action might be the receiver of the action, not the subject, but the object. And in that case, it will end with an on. Hebrew has none of these characteristics. Earlier Semitic, Hebrew only has, as we have it, the noun in one form, just like in English. John bit the dog bit John. If we don't have the order of the words in English, we don't know who bit who. In Hebrew, same thing, different order sometimes, but same thing. But in Greek, you can swap them back and forth because one is marked as the biter and one is marked as the bitten. There are basic structural differences between them, and I don't want to get too complicated because Hebrew is descended from languages that, like Greek, have markers of what a word is doing in a sentence, but they're lost by the time we get to Hebrew proper. And more important, the system of how those, what we call case endings, those markers of function, how they operate, is different in the languages from which Greek is descended and those from which Hebrew is descended. Greek comes from Indo-European. It's related to Hittite and Latin, and of course the Romance languages through Latin, and Indo-Germanic, and so on. Hebrew is related to the Semitic languages. None of which is to say that there aren't a lot of vocabulary words that are shared across the languages because they lived in the same economic zone and same cultural zone as one another for a long, long time. And that's why you'll get a word bomos in Greek, which means altar, and the word bama in Hebrew, which means, it's translated a high place, but it really means the altar that one puts up for sacrificial occasions outside of a temple. So really, they share concepts, and those concepts can have very similar names. A lot of their vocabulary does, but it's not a direct relationship between Hebrew and Greek. It's very indirect.
What is also involved in this claim is the claim that the Septuagint is the original text and that there was no Hebrew Bible preceding it. Or in other cases, a variant of that claim is that the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and the Septuagint, the Torah, the first 5 books of it, was written simultaneously with the Septuagint in the 3rd century BC.
I don't mean to be in any way as mean-spirited as I'm about to be, but there is actual evidence that this cannot be, in the forms of a few passages in Hebrew that in the Greek mimics the Hebrew. That is to say, if the Septuagint, the oldest version of the Septuagint, were pure Greek, there are a lot of expressions it would not have. And in fact, there are a number of places where you can show that the Greek can come from the Hebrew, but the Hebrew can't come from the Greek. Which is to say, if in a gospel, Matthew, there is a passage that says that the world will die in fire and stink. The word stink can be a misreading of the Hebrew in fire. But the Hebrew in fire is not going to be coming from the Greek to stink. So they did, in cases where there are disagreements as to the meaning of the text, there are a lot of places where the Septuagint clearly has to be derived from the Hebrew and not the other way around.
Another thing that is involved in this claim is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least some would look at it this way. Like I remember that you pointed out, and we talked about this in the last episode. 1 Samuel is closer to the Septuagint. Some would look at that and say that's evidence that the Septuagint is the original text. How would you respond to that?
We have to get into the whole question of how the text was transmitted in order to answer that question. In a really brief sketch, what I'd point out to you is that the Septuagint is probably older than the earliest Hebrew manuscripts that we have. Unfortunately, this isn't true of the actual manuscripts of the Septuagint. So if you want to compare manuscript to manuscript, the Septuagint has older manuscripts except for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are older than the Septuagint. Plus, in case your readers, your audience are interested, there's a 6th century tomb in Jerusalem, in the Hinnom Valley, where the priestly benediction of Numbers is quoted almost word for word, not exactly word for word, but almost word for word on some silver scrolls. So we have the actual biblical formulation in Hebrew in the 6th century BC in Jerusalem of a biblical passage. If you wanted the oldest manuscript, the oldest written evidence of either of them, that would actually be it. But it is admittedly just one short passage. It is, the problem is that when the Greek is closer to the Septuagint, as it can be in Samuel, it is not always closer to the Septuagint. When the Greek is closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is not only closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls alone, it often has chronicles on its side. Now,
Hmm.
I don't mean to say that Chronicles is correcting Kings or Samuel, and that these readings are late adaptations. What I mean to say is that these are legitimate variant readings of the text, and here's what I meant by going into the transmission history. When scribes copy a text, they make mistakes. Each scribe makes a dozen mistakes or 20 mistakes in copying any extensive scroll. And if you go through the Great Isaiah scroll, which is the most complete of our Qumran texts, you will find that there are differences between it and the Hebrew, and differences between it and the Septuagint. These are mixed and matched. And the reason is that the Hebrew comes to us from Jerusalem ultimately, but it comes to us through a long line of transmission in different locations. And the Greek, same thing, comes to us from a series of scribes and editors who are correcting to the Hebrew as the Hebrew evolves, because the Greek translators thought they were translating the Hebrew. And so we keep getting changes to the Greek over time to get it closer to the Hebrew. Some of them are stylistic, but most of them are actually not stylistic. They're changes that are made because the Hebrew text has changed in the interval. We're talking about minor scribal errors. Again, something like 95% of them have no real significance whatsoever. Spelling the word him without the I, for example, something like that. But the basic difference between the two of them is that they're copied and mistakes are made in the Greek as well as in the Hebrew in copying over multiple generations. And so over multiple generations, you get this large bag of variants in different manuscripts. And if somebody comes along and collates those manuscripts and finds a really sensible reading, the odds are they're going to choose the sensible reading and insert it into their text. But most of the time, the scribes are just copying what they have in front of them and making a few more errors along the way. It's not like this invalidates the text in any way. It's more that as one compares it, one can't say, okay, the Greek is closer to the Hebrew or to the Dead Sea Scrolls. One can say, in this case, the Greek is closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls. One can say, in that case, in fact, in Samuel, as often happens, the Greek lines up with the Hebrew against Qumran, against the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's really a mixed bag of errors in scribal copying, and a few, really few, actual changes to a text. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 32, there's a famous line that when Elyon, the highest God, portioned out the nations, he portioned them out according to the number of the children of, and then the Hebrew reads Israel. And the Greek and the Dead Sea Scrolls read God. The number of the sons of God, the implication is that each of the sons of God has a nation that God is responsible for, which is, of course, how states in the ancient world looked at things. The number of the children of Israel avoids the problem of having subordinate beings called God or sons of God supervising on God's behalf. So it avoids the anti-monotheistic principle operating behind the text. It's again, I don't think it's a huge deal, because those sons of God are later called angels, and we integrate them into our system of theology. But that kind of change does occur. My personal favorite is when Saul, in the summary of Saul's conquests, he lists all all the people he fought in 1 Samuel 14 at the end of the chapter, and concludes with a summary that is wonderful. The summary is, wherever he went, he, and the Hebrew reads, did evil. And the Greek reads, wherever he went, he rendered salvation. And the difference is the difference between a line, one letter, where a line has a little circle at the top, and one letter where that circle is missing. It could be an ink blob that led to the reading, he did evil, but the scribe liked it. And it might also have been a kind of a ideological joke played by the scribe. The older texts have, he rendered salvation, no question about it. But the kinds of scribal errors that you get and the kinds of emendations that you get, again, make it pretty clear that you are not dealing with a Greek original, and that the texts, the textual traditions are very complex to unwind from one another because of the errors in all of the transmission down to the advent of printing, at least. And even there, there's the Adulterer's Bible, where the 10th one of the commandments reads, "Thou shalt commit adultery." A simple scribal error. But yeah, I wouldn't want to reconstruct the text on the basis of that particular mistake.
And the Septuagint it just started out with just the first 5 books of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, which is the Torah, and so it wasn't even the whole thing. And the full Septuagint that includes every book in the Old Testament didn't come out until way later.
That's the story we're told, and I don't know if it's true or not.
Okay.
However, I will say this. Number one, the first 5 books, the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, are used in the liturgy in the synagogue. The portions are read every week, and they are therefore among the most stable of the books we have textually. I think we have the fewest per verse. I think we have the fewest significant deviations, variants in the first 5 books that we have anywhere in the Bible. And this, by the way, these are not problems that just bedevil the Bible, and it's a mistake to think they are. We have the same problem with Greek. We have the same problem with Homer. There are variants in the manuscript traditions and in quotations of Homer by early readers, like pre-Socratic philosophers. I mean, we're talking about people even 200 years after Homer was supposedly written, that already suggest that we have a different text of Homer floating around than the one that people now use to translate from. But if you go and buy the books from Oxford or Teubner that have the variants of Homer, the variant readings, you'll see that we're looking at the same phenomenon as we're looking at in the Bible. Any text that's been copied that much is going to give us this kind of fit.
And those that place the Torah in the 3rd century BCE, and especially the ones that claim that the Septuagint is the original text, they typically tend to dismiss what we see on this slide, the documentary hypothesis diagram. Could you explain what's happening here to the audience?
This is a really fun thing, actually. All right. Back in the 17th century AD, a picaresque character named Isaac Lapereire, who started life as a Marrano Jew and a Catholic, and converted to Protestantism and then converted to a kind of religion of his own called pre-Adamitism. Before, it's about his thinking there are people before Adam, and then converted back to Catholicism at the end of his life in order to enter a monastery. He was a diplomat. He was a librarian, and he was a scholar. And he's the first guy that we know of outside of the rabbinic tradition to start pulling apart problems with the idea of Mosaic authorship and suggesting that there's more than one author in the Bible. His stuff was really crazy and really lunatic fringe kind of thinking, even for the time. But it was picked up by two guys who made it stick. One of them was named Thomas Hobbes in a book called Leviathan, a British philosopher who had a very significant impact on British constitutional theory. And the other was a fellow named Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, who was excommunicated from the synagogue of Amsterdam, in fact, for picking up La Pereire's ideas. And these guys pointed out that what we really knew about the Torah was, one, that the book of Deuteronomy was identified. They proceed on this. The book of Deuteronomy is identified as Moses's words, and it presumes life in the land. In other words, the laws that Deuteronomy produces don't just project what life in the land is going to look like, but they reflect the experience of life in the land. So they, as 17th century Europeans, and looking around them and at how state religions were structured, decided to regard Deuteronomy as a kind of base law that was older than the other stuff in the Pentateuch. And while they were doing this, they were making fun of, or shall I say, pointing out seeming contradictions in the Bible. Great. One of the ones that Spinoza has been credited with, I can't find it in his work, is that when Isaac blesses Jacob, he is 99 years old. And that is true. And when he dies, and he's on his deathbed when he blesses Jacob, we're told he's about to die. He dies a couple chapters later at the age of 170. Now, a 71-year-long deathbed scene of the blessing of Jacob doesn't seem hardly plausible. They and of course, Spinoza especially stands on the principle that we don't explain history based on mythology. We don't explain history we don't admit miracle as a causation in historical reconstruction. A century later, now we come specifically to this. A century later, we have a small industry developing in Germany of people trying to pull apart what the components of these books that weren't written by Moses alone, but had to have been contributed to, at least, by more than one author. The creation story, there are two creation stories. One is very universal, one is very personal. That was where La Pereire started back in the 16th, in the 17th century. But the Germans, really, of the 19th century, of the late 18th century, started to see connections throughout the Pentateuch. And right there in the middle of the chart, sort of dead center, a little below, you have P with an asterisk.
Mm-hmm.
These Germans started to see that the narratives of P, a source of the Bible, we'll come back to that in a second, that they could connect Genesis 1 to other stories in Genesis. And they noticed that Genesis 1 used a different name for God than Genesis 2 and 3. So Genesis 1 uses Elohim, and Genesis 2 uses Jehovah or Yahweh, however you want to pronounce it. As they developed their technique over the course of the next 100 years, they were able to trace the P narrative all the way through the first 5 books of the Bible. And it was a complete and self-contained narrative, stood on its own, largely concerned with cultic organization, so priestly assignments and singers' assignments, and what one did in the instance of this or that sin, and how this or that sacrifice was to be carried out. And they found that the others, which are up to the left, J-E and J and E, of which J-E is just a combination, were also continuous sources. In other words, it was a narrative that made sense by itself. And when you divided the narratives into J, E, and P, each narrative was consistent within itself and used consistent language. For example, the name of the God. J uses the name Jehovah and uses it all through Genesis. And E and P only reveal the name, and we have 2 revelations, one in Exodus 3, one in Exodus 6, of Yahweh's name. E and P reveal the name only to Moses. So J says it is used from the time of Enosh, the son of Seth, and so I believe that's where. And E and P think it was only revealed as a name to Moses. Okay, in other words, this whole apparatus was actually a response to the doubt that Hobbes and Spinoza had created about the Mosaic authorship of the Bible. This was originally a defense of the Bible's being a logical and intelligible document, which was assembled by somebody. Okay, now Spinoza thought it was assembled by Ezra, which is a very popular view even today. And he's basing himself partly on biblical and partly on rabbinic tradition there. But regardless, and the early Catholic defenders of the Bible who introduced this kind of scheme claimed that Moses was the one who put it together, put Genesis together, and the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Pentateuch, the rest of the Torah was a coherent narrative that Moses himself wrote. Didn't write. He made it out of the pieces. He made Genesis out of the pieces, and he wrote the rest of it either from records kept by people working for him or just out of his own head. Okay. In 1804, a guy named Deveda comes along and definitively states that, look, nobody really believes that I want to talk to that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible at this point, because it's clear that what we're dealing with is a lot of myth and folklore and stories that aren't meant to be historical. In fact, they're meant to be educational in another way. And there you go. All of a sudden, when he did that, and he identified at the same time Deuteronomy as the book of the law found by King Josiah in 622 BC, so 600 years after any Moses, and showed that it had not been in effect before 622 BC, that's when the whole picture began to consolidate to the point where it became absolute dogma in biblical studies by the end of the 19th century. That dogma is being taken apart a little now. How we model the way these things were put together is really a big issue in contemporary scholarship. But the really classic formulation at this point is a book called Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. And in it, he combines the analysis of the Pentateuch, which is on the left side of your screen, with the creation of the books of Joshua through Kings, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which are called DTR, the Deuteronomistic history. And so he's tried, and now many people are with different models as well are trying to see how the first 9 books of the Bible were assembled, not just the first 5 books of the Bible. And the linchpin is clearly Deuteronomy. But if you go back to the first 5 books of the Bible for a second, what Friedman established is that P actually has JE, has them combined with one another. In other words, the J source and the E source had already been edited together when P was written. And he knows this because P actually has the events of its narrative occur in the order of the combined JE narrative and not of the individual stories of J and E. So the first redactor, in fact, is the redactor of JE, the first R, the first editor who combines sources is the guy who put together J and E. The second editor in this scheme is the guy who put together JE with P. So you had a JEP. And in this scheme, the third editor is the guy who put Deuteronomy together with JEP and created the Torah out of that. It's a complicated model, but actually it's the most economical model that scholars have come up with to explain the nature of this literature. I just want to add one more point on that before giving up, and that is the nature of the combination is such that someone like P will come along and strip out all references to angels from the JE narrative he inherits and give you a version of that narrative that is more theologically acceptable in his day than the JE narrative was in his day. In other words, as angels became a little bit unkosher because of the more monotheistic tendencies of P's era in the 7th century, that's why you need updates and retellings in the same way that we have like Lamb on Shakespeare or retellings of the same story to suit new sensibilities in remakes of movies and so on and so forth. And Deuteronomy is probably one of the most monotheistic books in the Bible, it and Jeremiah and 2nd Isaiah, because it really does insist that God is not, he has no form, he's fire. He has no fixed form. And that kind of speculation about the nature of God, that kind of theology, is something we're not seeing in JE, where God walks in the garden and God eats meat with Abraham and so on and so forth. J.E. reads much more like Greek mythology, and P and D read more like what we think of when we think of Israelite religion. They read like monotheistic theology.
So we have one PayPal question, and then after that we have a super chat. So I'm going to put those questions on the screen. Jojo, thank you for the PayPal donation. Sir Professor Baruch Halpern, are the 22 books of the Tanakh consistent in theology? Can you make a summary of the dating of the biblical manuscripts we have found today?
Let's hold that up there. Let's start with a summary of the dating of the biblical manuscripts we found. In Hebrew, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the earliest of which is 2nd century BC, and the biblical scrolls of which go back that far. Okay, so 2nd century BC, for sure, we've got Hebrew manuscripts already. The next Hebrew manuscripts that we have that are even remotely complete come from the 9th and 10th centuries AD. So the Aleppo Codex, and then I think actually it may be early 12th, the Leningrad Codex are really the oldest modern or medieval manuscripts we have. After which you start to get diffusion, and when people do look at just the Hebrew, which a guy named Kennicott did in the 18th century or at the end of the 17th century, and it was eye-opening. The manuscripts that tend to get taken into consideration are early printed manuscripts. We don't have that many big Hebrew, Leningrad and Aleppo and a couple more big ones from before printing, but it's the early printed manuscripts that really form the basis of people looking at the Hebrew. The Greek stuff is, we get fragments of Gospels that are 2nd century AD. We don't get much Hebrew Bible in Greek until we come to, I think the oldest is Codex Vaticanus, the Vatican Codex, the Vatican translation of the whole Bible Codex. And that, I don't even know the date of, but it can't be before the 9th or 10th century AD. So we're really looking at a big gap between Qumran and anything after it. Is there a unified theology in the Hebrew Bible? There is, if you want to unify it, absolutely. And you unify it by taking things like God walked in the garden in the cool of the day, because he's not dumb. He's not that dumb. Sorry, he's not dumb enough to walk while it's hot. Okay, God walked in the garden in the cool of the day. You don't take that literally. If you are a later Jew or Christian, or probably I would say Judean in the 5th century even BC, you take that as a metaphor, and you even when you have fantastic stories about ancestors, about patriarchs, you even take those as metaphors. Or you take them entirely literally as historical. But the unified theology is something we impose and not something they suffered from. One of the beautiful things in my mind about Israel is that it is really, its origins are really as a displaced people, or as displaced people, displaced persons who came together. And they never developed a really central authority in the way that the Catholicism did for interpretation. Now, that said, even in Catholicism, there's so much variety in the church fathers' interpretations of things, in medieval interpretations of things, that even there you really can't talk about more than a framework within which the theology is unified. The pieces don't all really fit that framework in either case, but they are frameworks that are imposed. Ask instead whether the state had a unified theology, and the answer is yes. At any given moment, the state had a unified theology, and that is reflected in these different stages that you can see in these sources. So in J, again, walking in the garden in the cool of the day is just the one that's in my head right now, but there are a lot of anthropomorphisms, and P and D get rid of as many of those as they can. I mean, there are things like, there are expressions that say "in the eyes of," meaning in the view of God, which are not real anthropomorphisms. We take them metaphorically because that's the convention of the language. In the same way, the creation stories, in J, the creation story, Adam in the garden, Eve, the expulsion, the creation story is poetic. It's a beautiful story that sort of tells you the place of men and women in the world and the animals and so on and so forth, and the relations among them. God forms the animals trying to make a mate for Adam and not quite getting there, and that is a metaphor for, or it is an explanation of, the homology, the similarity between the physical construction of the human body and the anatomy of an animal body. These are very nice stories, and they express a great deal of meaning, and they're not worried about God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. They don't care about anthropomorphism. They're not concerned with it. Well, P is concerned with anthropomorphism, and he gets rid of it. Gets rid of angels, for goodness sake. Deuteronomy, much the same. They reflect different state theologies in different periods. And so P and D are children of the era when Josiah is reforming the cult and really suppressing the worship of gods other than Yahweh in public institutions. So I hope that answered that question.
Gnostic Informant, thank you for the $5 super chat. His question is, do you see any examples of repurposing of ancient Canaanite mythology in the Old Testament?
In my mind, the oldest story that we probably have is the story of the hero. I personally think it goes back to primate bands, but that is really typical of how mythology forms, because the biblical heroes like Moses and Joseph and even David go through the same journey that the classical hero goes through. The Oedipus hero, who is expelled or the object of an attempted assassination at birth, who then comes back after a youth about which we know very little to capture his home crown, and so on. Okay, and rules by beating a monster off, or in Oedipus' case, or by defeating the Philistines in David's case is implied, or by defeating the gods of Egypt in Moses' case. So, and then whoever this is dies at the top of a mountain and nobody knows where he's buried. Pretty standard pattern, and some of the biblical figures score pretty high in this whole scheme of the myth. We have very similar myths in Canaan, absolutely. We have the myth of the hero is applied to the storm god Baal, whose real name is Hadad or Hadu, and the myths that we find at Ugarit in the 14th, well, really in the end of the 13th century BC, but okay, we think they start in the 14th century BC. The myths that we find in Mesopotamia, the Babylonian creation story, where the storm god goes out and defeats a chaos god and makes order and divides the world into realms of fertility and realms of infertility, sea and dry land, and so everything you see in Genesis 1, that stuff goes back beyond the Israelite stuff. It's not important where you steal your stories from, your plot lines from, because there are only so many plot lines to go around. I think Goethe identified 33 plots. That's all there were. And I think dramatic situations. And I think that since then, literary critics have ballooned that number up to like 38 plots. It doesn't matter where you steal your plot from. You're going to be stealing your plot. Nothing you think of is going to be original in terms of plot, at least in a sort of general overview way. Classic old TV plot was, and now this needs to be updated, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. I mean, and okay, you probably could describe half of the movies ever made that way. So the plot is going to repeat itself and get alluded to because it's familiar. People know these stories. They're told around campfires. They're told to the children and so on. What's important is how you take them and what you do with them once you take them. And the biblical material is really interesting in that way because you've got a God featured here who doesn't have real competitors, who doesn't have competitors that stand a chance. We don't hear about Baal or Yahweh fighting the sea god, really. We hear about Yahweh taming the sea. That's a big difference theologically. So yeah, they use the old Canaanite stuff and they use it plentifully and they share a lot of practices with the Canaanites. They don't just take them. They take them and they apply them to their own situation. And it's in that application that any genius they have lies.
What do you think about the claim that the Greek god Adonis, that his name Adonis is related to the Hebrew Adonai?
Good one. You know, of course, that Adonai in Hebrew is an honorific, meaning my Lord, my master, my liege, I think might be the best translation. It is applied to God, but it is not a substitute for God's name. And we get a lot of words applied to God that you could talk about in Greek terms as well, or Canaanite terms. I mean, Yahweh is called my Baal. You will no longer call me my Baal, says Yahweh in Hosea, implying that they had been calling him their Baal. And in fact, we have a number of people who have the title Baal in their name who are clearly being named for Yahweh, like Saul's sons, Eshbaal and Mephibaal. We even, I believe, at some point have we do. We have a Levite whose name is Baaliyah. My God is Yahweh. So my Baal is Yahweh. So the title is Yahweh Baal in Canaanite mythology? No. Adonis is a dying and rising god in Greek mythology. He goes to the underworld and comes back up. Is brought back up. And that is a characteristic that doesn't apply to Yahweh. So while the name is the same as the word Adonai in Hebrew, it really is the same word, Adonis and Adonai. Again, the application is different in the one culture than in the other.
What do you make of the claim that Hercules is Samson? Some say that Samson was copied from Hercules, or Hercules was copied from Samson.
That's a really good one.
Hmm.
And the reason is that Samson is from a tribe, Dan, whose name is very similar to the word Danaan, which is applied to the Greeks in certainly in Virgil, but it's older than that. You know where both these guys come from? And this is something we always sort of forget to do, which is look outside the box. These guys both come from a character or from a plot line, which is first attested in a thing called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have pieces of it, little kind of plot, little stories about Gilgamesh. You might almost call it like a collection that isn't collected of stories, like Sherlock Holmes. Okay, the short stories of Arthur Conan Doyle all appear in newspapers, or in magazines, before they're collected into books, and that's what the early fragments of the story of Gilgamesh look like. And then sometime in the early second millennium, like 1700, or God, really this is a guess, they get put together into a continuous narrative. And some of them get omitted and new things are introduced, but he's wrestling bulls, and he's swatting people, and he's overactive. He's got like ACDC, and he's, in general, a wild man who has a wild companion as well. Samson doesn't have a companion. Hercules doesn't have a companion. But the idea of the hero going out and performing incredible feats of strength, but not being exactly perfect about it, is the shared plot element. Gilgamesh also gives us another set of documents, and that's Homer. The Odyssey is essentially an adaptation into Greek and into the Greek cultural world of the Gilgamesh epic. And Odysseus is I would say, much improved version of Gilgamesh and of Samson and Hercules as a result. But I do have to say, Hercules gets a constellation, and you have to wonder whether Samson had one as well, just for fun.
And what do you make of the claim that Jonah is based on Jason, or vice versa? Jason is based on Jonah.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that one. I wouldn't pay any attention to the J at the beginning of the name or the N, but it does seem kind of far-fetched. Sorry, there's a huge difference between the quest, which Jason has, and the let me get the hell out of here flight that Jonah has. And I don't see a direct comparison. I do see that Jonah satirizes the kind of quest that Jason accomplishes. This is someone who, Jonah accomplishes his quest against his will. And he even stages a sit-down strike outside of Nineveh when the people actually respond positively to his word of God. So, and they fast and so on, and the cattle, and put ashes on their head, and so do their cattle. Clearly you're dealing with some sort of satirical comment on prophets in the case of Jonah. There's nothing satirical about the Jason story. In fact, it's tied up with some of the most fraught Greek myth that you can imagine, the Medea material and the relationship to the Bakken coal. I could see Jonah as a kind of a sideways commentary on that, but really Jonah is, I think, talking about how all the prophets say, I wish I didn't have to tell you this, but you're dead. Jonah wishes he didn't have to tell them that they could repent. He didn't want to see them repent over there in Nineveh.
Final slide. Okay, so this is probably, well, I'm not sure if it's, I mean, it could arguably be the most outrageous of the claims in all 8 slides. So as you see, what's going on here is someone's thinking that Moses is Thutmose I, Solomon is Pharaoh Simon, Pharaoh Amenemhat I is Abraham, and King David is Pharaoh Puset. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. Pharaoh Pusesines I.
That's good.
What do you make of this?
I really love it. I'm sorry. I mean, this is a wonderful collection of things that I'm treating seriously that I normally wouldn't. I have to say that it is a characteristic of the Bible and its appeal as a work that permeates our culture. Unfortunately, I think less and less in the more elite culture, but still permeates our culture and generates a lot of fan literature. And if you really want to look at the evidence for any of these, it's going to be that someone got it through his head that there was a connection that could be made. And in the absence of really carefully looking at the hardcore evidence, which I would consider archaeological and linguistic, they make historical equations that are simply the same as alien pyramid builders. Now, everybody and their mother knows that aliens did not build the pyramids. They were natural formations. But the fact is that you can still make these kinds of claims in public, and scholars won't take them seriously. Academics will not treat these seriously. But they're really based on a sort of uncertainty that we have as to the solidity of the historical frameworks that scholars and churches build around the Bible. And there are uncertainties in those frameworks, in those historical frameworks. They're not this bad. How Seaman could be Solomon himself when Solomon is said to have married either Seaman's daughter or the daughter of his immediate predecessor. Is a little bit puzzling. I'm sorry, it's not definitively puzzling. It's not, but it's why, how, why would you do this kind of stuff? Every one of these hypotheses, okay, sorry. Every one of these hypotheses is basically a historical reconstruction that is kind of fan lit rather than a real historical reconstruction. But more important, every one of them is kind of based on a notion that can then be shored up in the same way that Graham Hancock will write on how the Ark is in Aksum in Ethiopia at the Aksum Monastery. Sure, it could be. But honestly, what are the odds? Well, there's a tradition at Aksum that the Ark was taken there when when Sheba went home, or when Shishak raided Jerusalem, which he didn't do, or at some later time, there's always a possibility that is highly improbable, that is elevated to the status of a thesis in these works. It's hard to know where even to start when you're confronting this stuff, but every one of these hypotheses has implications that reach into other realms of history. And when you take the implications and follow them through, not one of them ever stands up. There's always some fact, some actual fact that they come crashing into, and that disqualifies them as possibility.
Yes, Jojo, I saw your PayPal donation. Thank you again for another PayPal donation. So his question is, do you think that Adam, Abraham, Moses, David, and Solomon existed? Because I want them to be real.
David for sure. Moses for sure. Solomon for sure. I think denying the reality of those, significant problem. Abraham is kind of not really as big an issue as you would think, because we know the name was used. Jacob, the name was used. Isaac, the name was used. We know there were people by those names. The best attested of them, by the way, is Jacob, because we have a Hyksos king whose name was Jacob. So the Hyksos are apparently Semites who took over northern Egypt.
Do you think? Yeah. Do you think the Hyksos Yaakov is Jacob?
I don't know. I really don't know. But boy, it is contemporary. Sorry, the Israelites identify themselves with the Hyksos in some way. The Joseph story is very clear that we're talking about a Hyksos king. He's living in the Hyksos capital of Avaris, Ramses, which is really Tel Daba, and he sees Joseph and Joseph's brothers. The Pharaoh does, but Egyptians, says the same source, can't stand herdsmen and don't associate with them. And these are herdsmen, these Israelites. So they don't go near them, is what the text said. So that in a way, what we're saying is that the Pharaoh is a Hyksos Pharaoh when Joseph goes down to Egypt. And the expulsion, logically enough, is the oppression is due to the rise of a non-Hyksos king, and the expulsion occurs under the son of that king. So we're talking about the new kingdom, the beginning of the new kingdom. The Abraham thing is much more difficult, though, because the Abraham thing. Sorry, let me go back to the Jacob thing for a second. The Jacob El, Hyksos king, is not necessarily the Jacob of the Israelites, but boy, oh boy, the name persists down to the time when the Israelites are identifying themselves as a group. And so it wouldn't be surprising if it were that same name. It just isn't certain. I wouldn't want to bet my farm on it. But the Abraham thing's really interesting because it's a name that we have. We even have a place in the South called the Field of Abraham. And that place name doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from Shishak's list of towns he conquered in the 10th century BC. That's an argument against Shishak being whoever they identified him with in the last slide. Shishak's list includes a place called the Field of Abraham. Now, my God, yeah, these people think they're descended from, or some of them think they're descended from a guy named Abraham. And it's a real name. It's not like a made up name. So, yeah, I think there was an Abraham. I don't know what he did. I don't know what many of these people did. I don't know what Moses did, from what the text tells me. But I do know that these are not names of ancestors that are just randomly concocted later. So, yeah, are they real? Yeah, they're real. Are they what the Bible describes them as?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for joining me once again. This has been a great stream. I think I'd like to have you back at some point to talk about and expand on the historicity of Moses. We can talk about the Hyksos, because that sounds like an exciting topic we should talk about eventually.
I would love to, and it's a delight as always to talk to you.
All right, everybody. Thank you for watching, and I thank everybody for the super chats and the PayPal donations. And I'll see all you later. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.